I was 34 years old, had 2 young kids, a rented apartment, and a life I had built with a lot of hard work. I thought I had already faced enough until the day my family placed a 2-year-old girl in my lap and told me, "She is your responsibility now." I refused. And they took me to court. In the courtroom without a lawyer, I opened an envelope and delivered a sentence that left everyone in absolute silence. No one expected what came next. But before we continue, check if you're already subscribed to the channel and let us know in the comments where you are watching this video from. We love knowing how far our stories are reaching. That Tuesday, I had gotten home after an exhaustingly long day. My oldest son Lucas was 6 and Mia was 3. I had bathed them both, made dinner, tucked them into bed, and I still needed to finish some Excel spreadsheets for work before going to sleep. That was my rhythm. Tight, tiring, but mine. I had built it with my own bare hands after a marriage that didn't work out after starting from scratch with 2 kids depending entirely on me here in Chicago. My routine wasn't glamorous. It meant waking up at 6 a.m., packing their lunches, dropping them both off at school, working an 8-hour shift, picking them up dinner, bath, storytime, bed, and still trying to knock out pending tasks before my head hit the pillow. Weekends were for laundry, grocery runs, cleaning the apartment, and trying to carve out a few hours just to be a mom without rushing. There was no margin for error, but there was a balance. That kind of fragile equilibrium you build knowing that anything off script could cause the whole thing to crumble. Then my mother called. Her voice had that specific tone I had learned to recognize over the years, a mix of urgency and something she had already decided on without even consulting me. She said she needed to see me, that it was important, and that she couldn't discuss it over the phone. I agreed, but my stomach immediately tied itself in a knot. The next day, I drove out to my parents' house in Evanston. My brother Daniel was there, leaning against the living room wall with that posture of someone who refuses to commit to anything. My mom was sitting with her hands in her lap, her lips pressed into a thin line. My dad was watching TV with the volume muted, acting as if none of this involved him. And on the floor, sitting on an old blanket, was a little girl with curly hair and dark eyes holding a rattle in one hand. 2 years old, tops. I asked who the little girl was. My mother explained with a calm demeanor that scared me more than any shouting would have. The girl's name was Lily. She was Daniel's daughter from a brief relationship he'd had shortly before marrying another woman. It wasn't exactly a secret that Daniel had a child out there, but he had never formally acknowledged her, never lived with her, and had certainly never been a real present father. Lily's mom had gone to family court demanding child support, and in the middle of all that chaos, she had dropped the girl off at my mom's house for a few days, which had quickly turned into weeks. Now, according to my mom, the situation was unsustainable. She and my dad were getting older, dealing with their own health issues, and were in no condition to be full-time caregivers for a toddler. Daniel had recently gotten married, and his new wife absolutely did not want the child in their home. The solution the family had come up with was simple, at least to them. I was going to take Lily. I stared at my mother for a few seconds, waiting for the punchline. It never came. I explained carefully, trying not to raise my voice, that I already had 2 little kids. I raised them entirely on my own with zero help. I worked full-time. I paid rent, daycare, health insurance, and groceries, all on a single income. I told them I lacked the emotional, financial, and logistical capacity to take on a 3rd child, especially one who wasn't mine, whose actual father was standing right there in the very same room, perfectly capable of taking on his responsibilities. Daniel said absolutely nothing. He just kept leaning against the wall, looking away. My mom chimed in, saying that family needs to stick together. My dad shifted his gaze back to the muted TV. I understood right then and there that no one in that room was on my side. I walked out without Lily. I drove back home with my hands shaking on the steering wheel, not out of anger, but from something much deeper. It was the crushing realization of someone who figures out they've been truly alone for much longer than they thought. The support system I believed I had was nothing but an illusion. I figured that was the end of it. I assumed the family would be offended for a while, that there would be passive-aggressive comments at Thanksgiving dinners, but that ultimately someone would figure out another solution. I waited for that to happen for 2 weeks. What arrived instead was a legal summons. My parents, along with my brother Daniel, had filed a lawsuit against me. The document was thick, filled with legal jargon I had to read twice just to comprehend. To sum it up, they alleged that I had the financial means to contribute to the upbringing and care of the minor, Lily, that I was maliciously refusing to help my family in a state of vulnerability, and they were petitioning the judge to force me to pay monthly child support as well as take shared custody of her on weekends. I sat there with those papers in my hands for an amount of time I can't quite measure. My daughter Mia wandered into the living room, climbed onto my lap, without asking as kids do, and just stared at me with her big bright eyes. I hugged her so tight I probably scared her a little. After the kids were asleep, I sat at the kitchen island with a mug of coffee that went completely cold before I even took a sip. I thought very carefully about my next move. Hiring a lawyer was completely out of the question. I simply didn't have the savings for a retainer. But I also wasn't going to let this process steamroll me without putting up a fight. So I started doing what I always do when faced with an impossible problem. I gathered information. I spent days reading up on family law and civil codes in Illinois. I learned that the law absolutely does not obligate an aunt to take custody or pay child support for a niece when the biological parents are alive and capable of working. I learned that the responsibility for Lily fell solely on Daniel, both legally and morally. And I also learned that to prove coercion or bad faith in a courtroom, a paper trail speaks infinitely louder than words. And I had a paper trail. Documents my family never in a million years imagined I had kept. There are things you hold on to without fully knowing why. Maybe out of caution, instinct, or a tiny voice in the back of your head warning you that one day it might make a difference. For years, I had saved bank transfer receipts, screenshots of text messages, and a hastily written promissory note signed one chaotic afternoon when my brother needed cash and swore he'd pay me back. He never did. I knew he wouldn't, but I kept the receipts anyway. In the days leading up to the hearing, I barely slept. Not exactly out of fear, but because my brain simply refused to shut off. I replayed everything, obsessing over every detail, trying to calculate how far this could actually go. My kids noticed something was off the way kids instinctively feel the weight in the air without understanding it. Lucas asked me once if I was sad. I told him no, that mommy was just doing a lot of heavy thinking. The following week, I went down to the county courthouse to better understand the procedural steps. I managed to speak with a court clerk who outlined the basics for me. She was incredibly blunt. Petitions like this rarely saw the light of day when there was a living, working father who had been identified. The problem was that Daniel had somehow managed to submit documents claiming recent severe financial hardship. It was a scam I recognized immediately, because I had literally loaned him money just 4 months before this whole circus started. Money he begged for, claiming he was in a tight spot. Money I sent him via Zelle because he was my brother, because my mom begged me to, because I still naively believed the word family meant something. And now, that same brother was using a manufactured narrative of poverty to justify why his own child should be my financial burden. The sheer cold-bloodedness of it hit me like a bucket of ice water. I began building my defense with the meticulous care of someone who has zero margin for error. I organized the bank statements showing every transfer I had sent Daniel over the last 3 years. It wasn't pocket change. It added up to a highly significant amount. Money that was never repaid money. My family conveniently forgot to mention when they demanded I take in Lily. I also printed out text message threads. Conversations where my brother spoke blatantly about his daughter. About how he wanted nothing to do with her. About how he was just waiting for someone else to step up and fix it. There was one text in particular he had sent me months prior, stating in plain English that he had no intention of raising the kid because his life had gone in a different direction. I preserved that message with special care, printing it in duplicate and storing it in separate folders. Meanwhile, my mom tried calling me several times. I ignored the first few. When I finally picked up, the conversation was brief. She told me I was being selfish, that the family was suffering, that Lily was an innocent little girl who deserved stability. I agreed with the last part. Lily was innocent, and that was exactly why she deserved a father who would step up rather than being used as leverage to extort an aunt who was already raising 2 kids on her own. My mom went dead silent for a few seconds. Then she said I had changed, that I was no longer the daughter she had raised. I didn't say a word. I hung up the phone and stared at the wall. What hurt wasn't the accusation. It was the realization that she genuinely believed it. To her, the daughter she raised was someone who accepted everything, endured everything, who always said yes when she desperately needed to say no, just to keep the peace within that toxic circle called family. But that daughter had learned the hard way that saying yes to everything protected no one. It didn't protect me, it didn't protect my kids, and ultimately it didn't even protect the family I was trying so hard to preserve. Over the next few days, I worked, took care of my kids, and spent my nights studying the court filings with a magnifying glass. I read every case multiple times. I spotted every weak link in their argument, and there were many. Their primary angle was that I had a higher socioeconomic standing than my brother, but financial solvency does not create a legal obligation to take custody of a niece. I already knew that. What I needed to show was the broader context, the truth those legal papers were trying to hide, and I could prove that context with dates, dollar amounts, and hard evidence. But it was late one night while digging through a plastic storage bin at the back of my closet that I found something I wasn't even looking for, something that would completely tip the scales of this entire dispute. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning. I woke up before my alarm, put on a simple dark blazer, prepared my manila envelope, and dropped the kids off at school a little earlier than usual. Lucas's teacher gave me that look, the one where someone wants to ask if you're okay but decides against it. I just offered a tight smile and left. Driving downtown, I didn't feel the nerves I expected. I felt something closer to absolute clarity. It's that feeling you get when you finally stop trying to control what other people think of you and only care about what is true. I walked into the courthouse, passed through the metal detectors, and found the assigned room. Outside the doors, my family was already waiting. My mom had a sour look on her face. My dad was staring at the floor tiles. Daniel was wearing a suit, standing next to a lawyer I didn't recognize. I had no lawyer by my side, just me, my envelope, and everything I had uncovered. The courtroom was smaller than it looks on TV. Beige walls, a long wooden table, hard chairs, and a narrow window overlooking a parking garage. The judge was a middle-aged man with wire-rimmed glasses and a face made of stone. The opposing lawyer, a woman with sharp dark hair and an assertive voice, set up her thick binder, clearly well prepared. I sat on the other side, alone. I placed my envelope on the table and kept my hands relaxed, even though my heart was hammering against my ribs. The proceedings started with their lawyer presenting the case. She spoke fluidly, choosing every word for maximum emotional impact. She painted a picture of a vulnerable toddler, a struggling family, and a wealthy aunt who selfishly refused to help out of pure spite. She cited statutes leaned heavily on the moral obligation of family solidarity, and built a narrative that to anyone who didn't know the truth sounded entirely reasonable. I listened to all of it without interrupting. I just took notes on a yellow legal pad. When the judge finally gave me the floor, I stood up slowly. I hadn't memorized a speech, I just relied on the mental timeline I had practiced while my kids were asleep. I started by acknowledging the undeniable facts. Lily existed, she was a minor, and I was indeed her aunt. I also confirmed that I had categorically refused to take custody or pay a dime in child support. And then I told the judge I wanted to clarify for the official record exactly who was suing me. I opened the envelope. The first piece of paper I placed on the judge's bench was an employment verification record in Daniel's name, dated just 2 months prior. It was a formal registered W-2 job with a declared salary obtained through a standard background check anyone could run. My brother's grand narrative of severe financial hardship had a fatal flaw. It was a documented lie. The opposing lawyer tried to object, but the judge raised a hand and told me to continue. The second document was the printed spreadsheet of every bank transfer and Zelle payment I had sent Daniel over the last 3 years. I placed a summary sheet with the total amount highlighted in neon yellow, followed by the individual receipts in chronological order. Next came the printed text messages, including the exact thread where he stated in his own words that he had no intention of raising his daughter because his life had moved on. The silence in the courtroom physically changed. It became dense, suffocating. But what came next was the piece of paper I had handled with the most care. Because while preparing for this hearing, something had urged me to check my older files, and that was where I found the bomb I didn't even know I was looking for. 3 years ago, my family had sold an inherited cabin up in Wisconsin. A portion of that property rightfully belonged to me, an inheritance from a great aunt who had passed away without children. The sale had been executed without my actual signature. They had used a document with a forged signature signed by someone else in my name. I had discovered it almost by accident years ago looking through old tax papers, but had buried it to keep the peace. I placed that real estate document on the table last, calmly, without theatrics, without raising my voice. I looked the judge in the eye and said that before we discussed my alleged obligation to financially support my brother's child, we needed to address the substantial amount of money this exact family had embezzled from me without my consent. I stated that there was hard evidence of document forgery and real estate fraud and that the proof was right there for his review. All the color drained from my mother's face. Daniel shot a panicked look at his lawyer. My dad kept staring at the floor, but his shoulders were rigid, the posture of a man bracing for an explosion. The opposing lawyer immediately requested a recess. The judge granted 10 minutes. I stayed seated in my chair while they huddled on the other side of the room, whispering frantically, in a tone I couldn't quite hear but entirely recognized. It was the frantic panic of people who had grossly miscalculated, who thought their victim was too weak to fight back, only to realize far too late that they had walked into a trap. I looked out the narrow window at the parking garage. I took a deep breath. I thought about my kids and I waited. Those 10 minutes felt like an eternity. I watched cars pulling in and out, people rushing down the sidewalk in coats, everyone living a completely separate story that no one else could see. There was something deeply comforting about it, the absolute certainty that the world kept spinning regardless of the drama inside this room. I pictured my kids. Right now they were at school completely oblivious. Lucas was probably wearing his signature frown, trying to solve a math worksheet. Mia was undoubtedly sprinting across the playground, not a care in the world. That mental image anchored me in a way no legal argument ever could. When the judge returned and court resumed, the demeanor of the opposing lawyer had completely shifted. She was still professional, but the aggressive edge was gone, replaced by extreme caution. It was the behavior of someone doing damage control. She tried to argue that the Wisconsin property issue was a separate civil matter, entirely unrelated to family court, and required its own investigation. The judge listened, jotted something down, and then looked directly at me. He asked if I had filed a formal police report or contacted the state's attorney regarding the forgery. I replied that I hadn't formally filed it yet, but that I had the complete evidence packet ready, and depending on how this specific hearing concluded, I would be walking straight to the district attorney's office that very afternoon. I didn't need to say anything else. The implication hung heavy in the air. What happened over the next few minutes was a quiet, systemic dismantling of their case. The lawyer retreated on all their main points. The judge directed sharp, unforgiving questions at Daniel regarding his current employment. My brother answered in a voice I had never heard before, stripped of all his usual arrogance. Just a low, pathetic mumble of a man who knew he had been caught dead to rights by a judge. My mom cried during the final stretch of the hearing. Not a dramatic, theatrical sobbing, but the suppressed tears of someone who refuses to show weakness but can't hold it together. I glanced at her a few times, not with anger and not with smugness. Just with a very specific kind of grief, the sadness that washes over you when you realize someone you loved deeply made choices that can never be undone. At the end of the session, the judge didn't issue an immediate ruling. He stated he would review the submitted evidence and schedule a follow-up, but he made it abundantly clear, on the record, that the legal responsibility for Lily needed to be fundamentally reevaluated, especially given the documented proof of the biological father's income and employment. I walked out of the courthouse with my envelope significantly lighter than when I walked in. I had literally left copies of everything on the table. Outside, the Chicago sun was surprisingly bright. I stood on the pavement for a moment, breathing in the crisp air, feeling my legs tremble as the adrenaline finally left my system. It's that delayed shake your body does, holding all the tension while you have to be strong and releasing it only when you're finally safe. I didn't go straight home. I walked to a coffee shop a few blocks from the courthouse, ordered an iced tea, sat at a corner table, and stayed there for almost an hour, doing absolutely nothing, just existing. Watching people chat, laugh, look at the menu, living out small, mundane moments that felt like an incredible luxury to me right then. It was a bizarre, beautiful feeling to occupy space without having to prove my worth to anyone, without having to be the strong one for somebody else. That afternoon, I picked my kids up from school. Lucas came running out rambling about a science fair project. Mia grabbed my hand in silence, swinging our arms as we walked to the car. I looked at both of them and thought with a clarity that sliced through everything else. This is why. It is always for them. In the weeks that followed, while I waited for the final ruling, the family dynamics shifted in ways I hadn't predicted. My mom stopped calling constantly. Daniel vanished off the face of the earth. My dad sent one brief text message, asking how I was, without ever mentioning the lawsuit. I replied that I was fine. For years, my family had grown accustomed to a version of me that always folded. A version that might complain under her breath, but ultimately gave in. A version that prioritized keeping the peace over everything, even when that peace cost me pieces of my own soul. When that version of me ceased to exist, they had absolutely no idea how to interact with the woman left standing in her place. The final judgment arrived on a random Tuesday via email, unannounced. I was walking out of my office building when my phone buzzed. I opened the PDF right there on the sidewalk, surrounded by commuters, completely unaware that this moment would define the rest of my life. The judge had dismissed their petition almost entirely. The legal reasoning was bulletproof. There was zero legal basis to force an aunt to assume custody or pay child support for a niece when the father was alive, identified, and verifiably employed. The request for weekend custody was similarly thrown out. As for the Wisconsin property, the judge noted in his closing remarks that the evidence of fraud had been forwarded to the state prosecutor's office for review, acknowledging the severity of the forged documents. I read it 3 times to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. Then I put my phone in my pocket, walked to my car, got in, shut the door, and only then did I let out a sob I hadn't realized I'd been holding in for months. It wasn't happy crying. It was much heavier than that. It was the tears of someone who has carried a crushing weight for a very long time, and the second they drop it, they realize exactly how heavy it was. The sleepless nights, the grueling legal research, the monumental effort to smile for my kids while I was suffocating inside. I sat there for 10 minutes and just let it out. Then I wiped my face, started the engine, and drove to pick up my kids. That night, I made pasta with tomato sauce, Lucas's absolute favorite, for no special occasion other than wanting to do something nice for someone I adored. They ate while talking over each other, telling me about their days. And I just sat there, listening with 100% of my attention. My brain wasn't fractured, lingering on some massive anxiety I couldn't control. I was just there. Over the next few weeks, extended family members started reaching out. A cousin called to say she'd heard through the grapevine and thought I handled it perfectly. An older aunt texted saying she had been rooting for me all along but didn't know how to intervene while the lawsuit was active. Small gestures, but they made me realize that the silence I had interpreted as total abandonment had layers. Not everyone who stayed quiet was against me. My mom took much longer to reach out. When she finally did, it was via text, not a call. She wrote that the whole ordeal had left her deeply shaken, that she never expected things to go that far, and that she regretted how she had handled the situation. It wasn't a direct, unconditional apology, but coming from a woman who would rather swallow glass than admit she was wrong. I knew exactly how much that text cost her. I didn't text back right away. I let a few days pass, not to be petty, but because I needed to know exactly what I wanted to say before I typed a single word. When I finally replied, I was honest and firm. I told her I was also shaken that I was still processing the trauma of it all, but that I refused to hold on to a grudge because resentments are heavy and I was done carrying heavy things. I told her I needed time and space to figure out what our relationship would look like moving forward if it could exist in a healthy way at all. She replied with a single red heart emoji. I left it at that. Daniel never reached out. I found out through mutual connections that he had finally been forced to settle with Lily's mother with court-mandated child support automatically garnished from his paychecks. I don't know the exact details. I didn't ask. Whatever happens in his life is no longer a crisis I have to manage or a burden I have to carry. Lily stayed with her mom, supported by her dad's money. When I heard that, I felt a profound sense of relief, not for myself, but for that little girl. Because what she needed was actual stability, built on real accountability, not to be passed around like a hot potato to solve a problem. The adults in her life were too cowardly to face. It's been a few months since the legal nightmare officially ended, and the biggest change isn't my relationship with my relatives, it's my relationship with myself. There was a version of me that existed for a long time, a version who learned very early on that the best way to be loved was to be useful. A woman who confused caretaking with self-erasure, who said yes when she was screaming no on the inside, terrified of what the no would cost her. That version functioned for a while. But really, she was just hoarding exhaustion, pushing it down deep and calling it adulthood, calling it maturity. It was only when they backed me into an absolute corner that I realized how much ground I had surrendered. I finally got a routine back with my kids that wasn't just pure survival mode. I started enjoying the little things again. Taking Lucas to his Saturday morning soccer games and actually watching the field instead of doom-scrolling on my phone. Sitting with Mia at the kitchen table, pretending to understand whatever abstract masterpiece she was coloring, listening to her explain it with total seriousness. Things I used to do on autopilot were now filled with actual presence. At work, I noticed a distinct shift in how I operated. When you stop bleeding energy, trying to please people who will never be satisfied, you suddenly have a massive reserve of focus you never knew existed. I got a promotion that had been delayed twice because of my personal instability. This time, there was no instability, just excellent work and a clear, present mind. One Friday afternoon, a coworker asked me how I was feeling about everything that went down. She knew the broad strokes the way office colleagues know when someone's life derails, without knowing the gritty details. I told her I was doing really well. She studied me for a second and said I looked different. I asked how. She paused before saying firm. I thought about that word the whole drive home. Firm. It wasn't that I was colder or more cynical. It was a different kind of strength. The firmness of someone who knows exactly what she will and will not tolerate. Of someone who stopped apologizing for taking up space. Someone who learned that a clear no is infinitely more respectful than a yes you can't survive fulfilling. A few nights ago, my mom called for no specific reason. Not to talk about the lawsuit, not to demand a favor, just to chat. She told me a ridiculous story about her neighbor. She laughed at something my dad burnt in the kitchen. It was a completely normal phone call, the kind we used to have before the bomb went off. I engaged in the conversation carefully. I didn't pretend nothing had happened, but I also didn't turn every pause into a battlefield. When we hung up, I thought about what that call meant. It wasn't a grand reconciliation. It wasn't as if the past was erased or entirely forgiven. It was more like two cars that collided head-on at highway speeds. We both got severely injured, and now we were slowly trying to see if the engines still turned over. I didn't need to fake a smile to keep her in my life. But I also didn't need everything to be perfectly resolved just to share a brief phone call. There was a middle ground, and I was learning to live in it cautiously, but without deadbolting the door entirely. As for the Wisconsin property, that case is making its way through the justice system. I won't share the details because it's still an active investigation, but the DA has the documents. The fraud is being handled, and whatever the outcome is, it's no longer a secret I have to shoulder alone. It is exactly where it belongs. The most practical, mind-blowing lesson I took from all of this: keep your receipts. Keep your bank statements, save your texts, get things in writing. Not because you should walk into every relationship expecting a lawsuit, but because when the people you love decide to weaponize the legal system against you, a lack of documentation is your fatal weakness. I had instinctively known this for years without realizing it, which is why I hoarded those papers. And when the time came, that manila envelope was the difference between walking out of that courthouse with my head held high or walking out financially and emotionally ruined. Today was a beautifully normal day. I woke up at 6 a.m., made breakfast for the kids, dropped Lucas and Mia off at school, and came back home for a bit before heading to the office. I sat at the kitchen island for 10 minutes with a hot cup of coffee, looking out the window at the quiet morning street. I wasn't stressing over anything urgent. I was just present, occupying my own home, without needing to justify my existence. It seems like a tiny thing, 10 minutes of silence. But for a very long chapter of my life, those 10 minutes were impossible. There was always a crisis. Always a fire to put out that wasn't mine to begin with. Always a voice telling me I needed to give more, do more, endure more, and I believed it for far too long. Not because I was weak, but because I had tragically confused enduring abuse with emotional strength and self-sacrifice with love. Strength is not about carrying everyone else's baggage until your spine snaps. I learned that the hardest way possible, but the lesson is carved into my bones. True strength is looking at a mess and saying, "No, I am not picking that up. That is not mine." Lily now has the legal structure she deserved from day one: court-mandated support, clear boundaries, and the burden placed exactly where it always belonged. I don't know how she's doing today or what her daily life looks like, but I wish her the absolute best with a sincerity completely free of guilt. She was never the villain. She was just a little girl caught in the crossfire of adults who were too cowardly to clean up their own messes. My kids are thriving. Lucas is turning 7. And he asks questions with a profound seriousness that sometimes leaves me stumped. Mia is full of a radiant joy that I want to protect for as long as humanly possible. I look at them and feel this incredible mix of love and responsibility. A responsibility that doesn't crush me because I actively choose it every single day. It is mine. Not out of guilt, but out of pure love. A few weeks ago, Mia asked me if I had a sister. I told her no, but that I had a brother who lived far away. She asked if I missed him. I paused for a second before giving her an honest answer. I told her that sometimes, yes, I do. I didn't miss how things actually were because the reality was toxic for everyone involved. But I missed what things could have been if people had just made better choices. If the people who made the mess had just cleaned it up. That grief is real, but it doesn't stop me in my tracks anymore. It just exists, like an old scar that aches when the weather changes, but doesn't stop you from walking. My mom and I are talking with a frequency we're still calibrating, finding a new rhythm. We aren't as close as I'd ideally like us to be, but our relationship is honest in a way it never was before. On a recent call, she admitted that the guilt of how she handled everything eats at her, that she let her paralyzing fear of losing her son drive her to make choices she knew were deeply wrong. I listened without interrupting. I don't know if I have the blueprint for how to rebuild this bridge, but I listened, and that alone is progress. When the dust finally settled and the noise faded, what remained wasn't blinding rage or burning resentment. It was a crystal clear understanding of exactly who I am and what I absolutely refuse to sacrifice: my children, my mental health, and my fundamental right to say no when no is the absolute truth. Even if that no makes people uncomfortable, even if it deeply disappoints someone I love. I am not a different person than I was before the summons arrived. I am the exact same woman with the same roots, the same capacity for love, and the same old scars. But I am a woman with boundaries. She finally learned to recognize, name, and defend above all else. If you are listening to this story and you see a reflection of your own life in it, whether it's with your family, your partner, or your job, do not wait until they push you to the absolute brink to figure out where your boundaries lie. The justice system might vindicate you in a courtroom, but it cannot refund the years you spent shrinking yourself to keep other people comfortable at your own expense. You deserve peace. Your own peace built on your own terms without ever asking for permission. Now, if you liked this story, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments which part left your jaw on the floor. Oh, and don't forget to become a channel member for access to exclusive videos I don't post anywhere else. I'll see you there.